Our speaker tonight is Dr. Mark Webster. He received his bachelor's from the University of Manchester in England and his master's and PhD from the University of California at Riverside. His research straddles the fields of evolutionary developmental biology, systematics, phylogenetics, and biostratigraphy. The primary group that he studies is trilobites. He has been at the University of Chicago since 2004 in the Department of Geophysical Sciences. Mark.
All right, thank you very much for the invitation, the chance to talk to you. I've heard so much about the ESCONI group, but never had a chance to actually interact with you until now. So this is great. I hope this will be the first of many interactions. Okay, so let me see if I can share my screen. And let's go there. Okay, can you all see my screen there?
Yes.
All right, and I'll go to the slideshow. There we go. Does that look like a PowerPoint? Okay, all right. I will talk to you tonight a little bit about the kind of research I do, which is exploring the evolutionary patterns and processes in trilobites. And what I do is covers many different aspects of studying the evolutionary history of trilobites. I'll just talk about a couple if I've got time tonight. But first of all, because this is a sort of general talk, I'll give a general introduction to what trilobites are and why people love them so much. Okay, so I'm sure that you're all fully aware of what trilobites are, but just so we're all on the same page, this is a picture of a great trilobite, Devonian trilobite, that many of you are probably familiar with. The trilobite body often rots away, all the soft parts, of course, but what we're left with is this hard exoskeleton, which was mineralized in life. It was impregnated with calcite, and that's very useful for us as paleontologists because it means that each individual trilobite has a very high chance of being fossilized. So trilobites are very common in Paleozoic age rocks from about 520 million years before present until about 250 million years before present. So they were around for about 270 million years. And they're very common as fossils because of this high chance of getting fossilized. The trilobite body itself, as again, I'm sure you're all aware, is divided into three regions from front to back. At the front end up here, you can see this is the head end. It's covered by a single shield, which we call the cephalon. You can see the eyes are on there. Behind the cephalon or head shield is this segmented region, which we call the thorax. I'll be talking a lot more about that later on today. And then at the very back end here, we've got the pygidium or tail shield. So the body is divided into these three regions from front to back, but that is not why trilobites are called trilobites. Trilobites are called trilobites because, if I can work out how to change my slide, there we are. Their body is also divided into three going side to side. So they have a pleural lobe on one side of the body, an axial lobe, this raised bit running from front to back right down the middle of the body, and then another pleural lobe on the other side. So if you break a trilobite in half, snap it across the middle like this and look at it edge on, you can see that it's got these three lobes, a pleural lobe, an axial lobe, and another pleural lobe. And that is why trilobites are called trilobites. So that's just their basic anatomy. And again, we'll be talking a lot more about the thorax in particular and a little bit more about the head as we go through today's talk. Trilobites, as of course I'm preaching to the choir here, are everybody's favorite group of fossils, except perhaps maybe dinosaurs, I guess. And the reason why people love trilobites so much is, well, I mean, they're just beautiful looking creatures. We know that they could enroll. We find them enrolled like this Carboniferous trilobite here, this Ordovician trilobite here. You can sort of see them in different stages of enrollment getting fossilized. And so they, you know, we understand how these bugs lived and crawled around on the seafloor and how they behaved in their day-to-day lives. And that attracts people to trilobites an awful lot. They also, of course, are famous for having these great eyes. Their eyes were also made of calcite. The eye lenses were made of calcite, which is very unusual and a bizarre evolutionary adaptation. But their eye lenses get preserved, and people love to find the trilobite eyes and look into the lenses and see all these little sort of bug-like eyes peering back at them. That's another appealing feature of trilobites. And then, of course, in trilobite evolutionary history, they were around for 270 million years. They evolved many morphological attributes that also make them very eye-catching. So, for example, here we've got a rather sort of boring-looking isotélus specimen here, but there are some very close relatives of that that exaggerated various parts of their body. For example, here, this one has evolved these big eye stalks, and its eyes are now perched right on the top of these pillar-like stalks. Trilobites also come in all different shapes and sizes. One of the body parts that we've talked about is the thorax, and different trilobite groups have very different numbers of segments in the thorax. So this one over here, this little pagetid trilobite from the Cambrian, has only 2 thoracic segments between the head and the tail shield. This trilobite right here, an inuelid, also from the Cambrian, is famous for having the most number of thoracic segments in its body. This one here has 103 segments, going all the way down to these tiny little ones at the end, and then a very simple button-like pygidium right at the end. So there's a huge range in the numbers of thoracic segments that different trilobites had. There's also a huge range in how different the different body parts look. So for example, here we've got a very clearly distinct pygidium in this scutelluid trilobite here compared to the thoracic segments. But if you look at this other trilobite here, this is a rictocephalid trilobite from the Cambrian, you can see that its body segments look all the same, all the way down to the very end of its body here. The pygidium is actually this part right here, and the segments making up its pygidium just look exactly like thoracic segments. So it's kind of bizarre. This trilobite over here on the left seemed to really know which segment was going to go in what part of the body, as it were, whereas this one here perhaps didn't too much, because all of its tail shield segments look just like its thoracic segments. We're going to talk more about the importance of that later on today. There's also many, as I said, many different shapes and sizes of trilobites. Some, like this paradoxidid trilobite, have a huge head and a proportionally tiny tail shield. In this lycid trilobite, it's the other way around. It has a proportionally small head and a huge tail shield right there. Oops, change slides. There we go. Some trilobites were very smooth, like this Laocoryph specimen over here, a plethopeltid trilobite. It's very hard to see the pleural lobes and the axial lobes in this thing. It's almost completely lost all of its features. And other trilobites, on the other hand, became very spiny, like this odontopleurid trilobite here, with big spines around the margins of the head, big spines sprouting off the back end of the head, and all the spines coming off the back of the thorax too. Some trilobites took that spininess to just bizarre extremes. This one here has oily margins around its head, huge ram's horn spines sticking off the back of its head, and these very elegant curvy spines off the rest of its body. A beautiful but crazy looking trilobite from the Devonian. This one here took it to a real extreme. This is another odontopleurid trilobite from the Devonian, and this one is so spiny that even its spines have spines. So some trilobites really just exaggerated their morphology an awful lot. And again, that's a reason why so many people love trilobites. This is another spiny trilobite. It's a bit of an ugly specimen. Its head is a bit crushed, but this is a completely unrelated species to the previous ones we were looking at. But again, you can see that this has convergently evolved a very similar, very spiny kind of morphology. This one really did get very sort of spiny around its edge of the head, edge of the tail, and even off its thoracic segments too. So the same kinds of morphological features evolved time and time and time again in different trilobite groups. Some trilobites also developed these weird sort of shovel-like extensions on the front of the head. This is a close relative of the one over here on the left. This is a Dalmanites. This is a somewhat awkwardly named Huntonia specimen here. And this one has evolved this sort of shovel-like extension on the front of its head. Crazy. We don't really know what the function of that was. Here's another specimen of the same thing, Huntonia, again, just showing this kind of shovel-like extension on the head and beautiful eyes. This one, though, is not very spiny, except for the big long spine on the end of its tail. This one evolved an even longer shovel-like extension on the front of its head and also became a bit spinier on its body. And then this one is, I think, my favorite trilobite of all time. This is just a really crazy trilobite that has it all. It's not only a very massively spiny trilobite with beautiful curvaceous spines sprouting off everywhere, but it had not just one shovel-like extension off the front of its head, but 4. This is a real crazy trilobite. We have no idea what this trilobite was doing, why it had these shovel-like extensions, what the function of these very delicate spines was. But whatever it was doing, it's certainly a beautiful looking trilobite. So trilobites are beautiful looking creatures. They attract a lot of attention. They're very popular, and everyone loves it when they find trilobites. So they've received a lot of attention in the popular masses. So there's trilobite t-shirts like this. This is my own t-shirt right here. I have too many trilobites, said no one ever. Very true. There is a pop group called the Trilobites. I've never actually listened to them, but they do exist. There is a vacuum cleaner called the Trilobite in Sweden, I believe they're sold. If you're in Disney's Animal Kingdom in Florida, there is a restaurant there called Trilobites, which when I went with my kids and wife, I was so excited to find that. I must have got a little bit delirious. And in fact, I was so delirious, I was quite happy to pay a grand charge of $8 for a Bud Light from that restaurant there. So I think I must have lost my senses for a while there. And people are so obsessed with trilobites, they even have trilobite corn mazes. This one is a trilobite corn maze in Wisconsin. From tip to tail, this is the biggest trilobite ever, 146 meters long, this trilobite. I would love to find a real one that big, but unfortunately, the biggest trilobite we know of is about 1 meter in body length. So trilobites are wonderful. They're great looking creatures. Everybody loves them, but they are also very scientifically useful. And this is what I want to talk to you about for the rest of today here. So this is a sort of cartoon time chart showing the age of the Earth. This is when the Earth formed over 4.5 billion years ago. And this is the present day right over here. And you can see that there's a good fossil, or there is a fossil record. Fossil organisms go back more than 3 billion years, about 3.5 billion years. There are fossils. But for most of the fossil record, it's single-celled microbial kind of creatures, and maybe a few seaweeds, multicellular seaweeds a bit later on. Here until here, just the very end of the Precambrian, we start getting animal fossils. And the earliest skeletonized animals that actually give a good fossil record don't come in here until the very base of the Cambrian period, at the base of the Phanerozoic. And as you can see, trilobites were about the first skeletonized animal groups, one of the earliest ones to appear. And they were then around for more than 250 million years, 270 million years trilobites were around for. Sadly, they did die out at the end of the Permian period. And that, of course, was before dinosaurs evolved. Trilobites were around for longer than dinosaurs have been around. And of course, humans are this last little pixel over here. We are very newcomers to the Earth. So trilobites have a very good and a very long fossil record. And they were one of the first animal groups to appear in the fossil record. They also occur in all kinds of marine environments. They were exclusively marine as far as we know. So they always lived under the sea, on the seafloor, but they lived in very shallow seas to base in all kinds of settings, deep water settings. Some of them were permanent swimmers. They lived in reef-like environments in shallow waters too. And of course, in this wide range of environments that they lived, they also showed adaptations to those environments. And so that's why we, again, have such a wide range of forms of trilobites. They're all adapted to these different ranges of environments. Not surprisingly, given this wide range of environments that they were in and the fact that they were around for such a long time, there's a huge number of trilobite species. The latest compilation, which is 10 years old now, therefore a little bit outdated, compiled roughly 20,000 species of trilobite. That's how many there are out there. It's actually about 22,000, we think, right now. Almost 4,000 genera of trilobites. About 150 or 160 families of trilobites grouped into 11 orders of trilobites. So there's a huge diversity of trilobites. It's a little bit demoralizing to a professional trilobite worker like me that about 1/3 of all trilobite families, we don't know which order they belong in. So we've still got a lot of things to learn and understand about the evolutionary relationships between different trilobite groups. About 1/3 of all trilobite families, we don't even know which order they belong into. They're completely mysterious, their evolutionary relationships. So we still have a lot to learn, but that's good. It keeps us busy. But there's a lot of trilobites. Here we've got a completely unreadable plot. I don't expect you to read this, but these are all 150 or 160 families down here. And this is geologic time from the base of the Cambrian to the end of the Permian over here. And what we've got is a range chart, just a simple range chart in black, showing the ranges of each of these 150 families of trilobites. So we know when these different groups of trilobites were around. And what we can do once we've got a chart like this is simply for each interval of geologic time, count how many, in this case, families of trilobites were around. And that gives us a diversity curve. And that's what we're looking at in the middle of this plot here. And it shows something really interesting. We've got the base of the Cambrian over here. Trilobites evolved somewhere in the middle of the lower part of the Cambrian. So trilobites first appeared here. And then we've got the rest of the Cambrian, the Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, and Permian, the saddest day in the history of life on Earth when the trilobites went extinct at the end of the Permian. But what you'll notice is that the trilobite evolutionary history is very bottom heavy in terms of its diversity. The vast majority of trilobite families, but also genera, as we'll see on the next slide, and also species, were in the Cambrian very early in their evolutionary history. And from the end of the Cambrian through to the end of the Permian, their diversity basically just dwindled. Okay, so this is a really interesting phenomenon. It suggests that trilobites underwent this explosive diversification very quickly, very early in their evolutionary history, and then sort of went out with a bit of a whimper, just kind of plodded along for the next 200 million years or so, 250 million years or so, and sort of went out with a bit of a whimper. So that's a really interesting pattern. We see that with this kind of diversity curve at the family level, but you can also see it even at the genus level. So this is genus level diversity curve, again, from the Cambrian through to the end of the Permian. But again, everything is going on in the Cambrian, to some extent the Ordovician, but then it just sort of crashes and trilobites just plod along, not doing much for the rest of their evolutionary history. Again, a very bottom heavy diversification curve, whether we're looking at species, genera, or families.
Mark?
Yeah.
You can see the Ordovician biodiversification event in trilobites 2 on that little peak.
Yes, so so even though diversity is declining through much of the Ordovician, you can see there are a few spikes here and there, but things were still evolving. It's just that the extinction rate was generally higher than the origination rate, so net diversity was dropping. Okay, but we'll talk much more about this coming up. And trilobites certainly do some interesting things in the Devonian and even in the Carboniferous. They're still doing interesting things, but just not the rate or the magnitude that they were doing things in the Cambrian. So I certainly don't want to say trilobites became boring after the Ordovician. That's absolutely not true. But compared to the Cambrian, they're not doing as much. What we can then do, since we've got this diversity curve, we can break it out into when the various families originated and also when the various families went extinct. So what we're plotting here again is a time plot from the Cambrian through to the end of the Permian. Now, though, we're showing it as each of these bars shows how many families of trilobites originated in any given interval. And again, this just highlights what I've just suggested, that trilobites were originating, were evolving very rapidly in this explosive diversification in the Cambrian, to a much lesser extent the Ordovician. And once we get beyond the Ordovician, for the latter more than half of trilobite evolutionary history, not a single family of trilobites evolved. They're all just playing around with the same families that had evolved much earlier on in the Paleozoic. The last new family to evolve appears in the lower Silurian. On the other hand, we look at the extinctions, and as you can see, extinctions are just going on all the time. Okay, so the explosive diversification up here, coupled with just long-term extinction, is why diversity curve, why the overall diversity curve peaks in the Cambrian and then sort of tails off. We can also see that with genus level data, again, just a different taxonomic level, but this is the per capita origination rate, so how quickly genera were evolving. And again, in the Cambrian period, the rate of genus level origination was astronomically high compared to what they're doing even beyond even during the early part of the Ordovician, during the Ordovician radiation. It's nothing compared to what they were doing during the Cambrian. Again, you do have spikes coming on later on. They're still evolving, but just not on the same rate or magnitude as they were during the Cambrian. And that's really interesting. Of course, all of this is just based on taxonomic data, just counting the names of species or genera or families. But it's also interesting to look at trilobite evolution from the perspective of morphological diversity, not just taxonomic diversity. Morphological diversity reflects what the trilobites actually looked like, not just what they were called, not just their taxonomic names, but what these things look like. And we call this phenomenon disparity. That's just a fancy word for morphological diversity. And what I've shown you here is this assemblage of trilobites. There's two species shown right here, and we have another assemblage of trilobites, also two species shown right here. Now, if we found this assemblage of trilobites, we would recognize, based on their taxonomy, what we're naming these things, that these are two different species belonging to two genera in two different families, and indeed two different orders of trilobites. The same is true over here. There's two different species belonging to two different genera in two different families and two different orders. So if all we're doing is counting taxonomic diversity, this assemblage over here is exactly the same as this assemblage over here, values of 2. However, if you look at the morphology of these trilobites, what they actually look like, you can see that these two species here look really similar. Their morphological diversity or disparity is very low. They're almost twins of each other, even though they're taxonomically unrelated to each other, evolutionarily unrelated to each other. They're very similar. On the other hand, you look at these two species, and one is very smooth with a lot of segments, one is really spiny with just a few segments. This is a much higher disparity, morphological diversity, than this one over here. So you can see that taxonomic data tell us one thing, but disparity data tell us something else. Disparity data, if we can quantify or measure what the trilobites look like, disparity is going to tell us things about perhaps the life modes of these trilobites. Perhaps these two trilobites had very similar life modes compared to these two trilobites. So when we're looking at trilobite evolutionary history, we not only want to count how many of them we're finding, but we also want to know something about what they look like. Now, we've already seen that trilobites underwent an explosive diversification in terms of their taxonomy. I've shown you those diversity curves. What about their disparity? What about their morphological diversity? Well, one easy way of doing this, and I'll show you, I'll talk much more about this if there's time later on today, is to count the numbers of thoracic segments. That's an easy measurement we can take off the trilobites, an easy count, and it's a measure of disparity. You might imagine if evolution just sort of plods along, that a group like trilobites would progressively through time achieve greater and greater and greater morphological diversity as the groups begin to diverge away from each other. So we might imagine perhaps in the Cambrian that there's little range of thoracic segments. And by the time we get through to much later in trilobite evolutionary history, that's when we're seeing the biggest ranges in terms of numbers of thoracic segments. When we actually, that's just a plot, again, just showing that there's a big range in disparity in trilobites, everything from 2 to more than 100 thoracic segments. So there is a high disparity there. But if we actually plot thoracic segment number, shown here, as a function of geologic time, again, from the base of the Cambrian through to the end of the Permian, what you can see is that, again, we see an explosive diversification of morphology in the earliest part of the Cambrian. And once we get beyond the Cambrian, the range of numbers of thoracic segments drops down to very narrow limits. So again, just like the taxonomic data, the morphological data are showing us that trilobites underwent an explosive diversification very early in their evolutionary history. And then throughout the subsequent, say, 200 million years of their evolutionary history, they were much more limited in their evolutionary innovation. They just sort of plodded along with nowhere near the sort of evolutionary innovations that they were showing during the Cambrian period. So this is really interesting. It's a very counterintuitive, but very obvious and striking pattern of trilobite evolutionary history. So now we've got geologic time going up here, the Cambrian down here, the base of the Cambrian, through the lower, middle, and upper Cambrian, through the Ordovician and Silurian. And what we're showing here is some very crude estimate of the trilobite evolutionary tree to the extent that we know what it is. You'll see there's lots of question marks on it, because there are lots of groups we don't know how they're related to each other. But the key point is this: in just the earliest, perhaps 10 or 20 million years of trilobite evolutionary history, they underwent this massive radiation event, both taxonomically and morphologically. We had this explosive evolutionary innovation if for the first just 10 or 20 million years of their evolutionary history. And for the subsequent, say, 250 million years of trilobite history, they were just sort of plodding along, tinkering with what they did in the Cambrian, but without really experimenting in anything genuinely new. And that's a really interesting pattern. So people have suggested then that these early Cambrian trilobites may just be weird. There was something about the early trilobites compared to all the later trilobites that we find in Illinois and elsewhere. There was something about the early ones that allowed them somehow to explore these evolutionary innovations, and that avenue for that potential for evolutionary innovation was sort of closed off to later trilobites. And so it's out there in the literature in a sort of vague, arm-wavy sense that there's something weird about early trilobites compared to later trilobites that allowed the early ones to experiment evolutionarily, and that door was then closed to later trilobites. And that's what really drives my research, is understanding what was going on. And is there really this big difference between the evolutionary capacity of early trilobites compared to the evolutionary capacity for later trilobites?
So you're trying to figure out why the trilobites are dwindling down from the Cambrian to the pulmonary?
So I'm trying to work out why trilobites achieved such a wide range of morphologies and such a high number of species so early in their evolutionary history. And then through the vast majority of the rest of their history, they just didn't really do as much in an evolutionary sense. They basically achieved their maximum evolutionary ideas, as it were, very early in their evolutionary history. And then after that, didn't really do that again. And so the question is, why? Why did that happen? The really interesting thing is it wasn't just trilobites showing this pattern, although trilobites are the best fossil group for studying this pattern. But in fact, all arthropods and indeed all animals are thought to show this same pattern. What we've got here is some data showing the rate of, in the top plot here, molecular genetic evolution through time from the Cambrian to the present day. And you can see that the rate of molecular genetic evolution in all arthropods, all bugs, insects, crustaceans, everything, including everything that crunches when you stand on it, all of these things showed a much higher rate of genetic evolution early on in the Cambrian, part of this Cambrian radiation or Cambrian explosion, and then slow down and just plod along through the rest of geologic time to the present. The same is true of morphological evolution in all arthropods, not just trilobites, but all arthropods and indeed all animals, was several times, in this case, 4 times higher in the Cambrian than it is in the post-Cambrian. So there's something really weird about evolution in the Cambrian associated with the initial evolution of animals that is unique to that period of time, and it's never been repeated since. The big question is why? It seems that all animals show this kind of pattern, but trilobites are the best ones to study to try to answer why, because trilobites are the only ones that have such a good fossil record, not only in the Cambrian, but also in the post-Cambrian, so that we can compare and contrast their patterns and rates of evolution. So that, in a nutshell, is what my research is all about. I try to document evolution patterns and understand those, understand the processes responsible for driving those patterns. And I do that by studying trilobites. Most of my research has been on early trilobites, the Cambrian trilobites, but nowadays I'm also studying lots of other trilobite groups all the way through to the end of the Permian as well. So nowadays I study them all. So because we've been locked up inside and because of the COVID crisis here for the last 18 months or so, I thought it would be just nice to sort of show some outdoors pictures here and remind ourselves that once this crisis passes, we can get out in the field again and do some collecting. I understand there's some field trips coming up, hopefully for you guys soon. So this is a map of North America, obviously, just showing all of the field localities that I do work at. The ones that are shown in red are the ones where I'm actively working on right now. The ones in blue are field sites where I've seen the material but haven't actually been there myself. So what I thought I'd just spend a few minutes just showing you some pretty pictures of some of these field sites around, in particular, the Cambrian rocks of North America. You can see they're going all the way around the edge of North America. So we'll start here in the Appalachians. As you can see, the field work here is not particularly glamorous. It's kind of like in Illinois, everything is overgrown. The best outcrops are in quarries, or in this case, a railroad cut here. Obviously, we're collecting trilobites here, but watching out for trains as well. Some of the sites, though, in that area are beautiful. This is a ominously entitled Rattlesnake Cliffs, but it's a beautiful view, and we're standing on some Cambrian age rocks right there, looking over Vermont. Most of my field work has been done in the southwestern United States, in the deserts down there. And that's because, of course, there's very little vegetation. So the rocks are beautifully well exposed. You can track single beds for miles and miles and miles along mountain ranges, sampling, as I'm doing here, in a trench, sampling all the different trilobites at lots of different stratigraphic levels from lots of different rock layers. So a lot of my work has been done there. I've also been up into the Canadian Rockies a few times and done some work up there. Beautiful place to work, very different. It's overgrown, but very mountainous. Spectacular field place. Here's, you can see it's a mad scramble over big boulders to actually get to the rocks, but it's well worth it. They're beautiful rocks up there. I've also been not only in the mountains, but also in the seas up here in Labrador, in Newfoundland. And here the Cambrian rocks are exposed right on the shoreline. So this is actually seafloor sediments of the Cambrian age loaded with trilobites and also these kind of reef-like structures here. But 500 million years later, they are still forming a seafloor of the present day sea. So we're scrambling over a present day seafloor, collecting seafloor trilobites. On there, you can see here, this is an ancient seafloor, but it's doubling up as a modern day seafloor as well. This surface here is just loaded with trilobites. It was a great place to work, one of the most beautiful scenic coastlines I've seen, at least when the weather was nice. And dolphins and everything swimming past. It was just a beautiful place to work. And I've even done field work way up here. This is almost as far north as you can possibly go on land. This is Ellesmere Island in the high Canadian Arctic. It's about 83 degrees north latitude. Here I am, that's the Arctic Ocean behind me here. This is summer, so a lot of the ice has retreated, the sea ice has retreated. And there's actually, you can't really see it very clearly in this photograph, but there's a walrus swimming around in the water behind me right now. Getting there is a bit of an adventure. You've got to ride in these fancy aeroplanes, twin otters that can land where there isn't a runway. To get into the more remote sites, we had to use a helicopter, so it makes you feel like you're in the A-team or something. There we are, getting into a helicopter, flying around in a helicopter, flying around up there. You have to camp in these very remote settings, no other people for hundreds of miles around. You have to carry a rifle around with you because there's polar bears. There's a polar bear footprint with a camera lens cap for scale, so they were definitely around. We had to be very cautious about that. But the geology is spectacular, just beautiful rocks. We called this thing the Helter Skelter Mountain. The rocks are kind of beautifully laid out here. We're measuring and collecting trilobites in this exposure. This is a very steep mountain up here, just loaded with trilobites. We were finding trilobites in all of these rocks up here. And you can just about see me. I'm right there, scrambling down, trying not to die as I scramble down this almost vertical cliff face there. So it's very scary, but a beautiful place to work. I've also done field work in Europe. I've been to Scotland. Of course, I'm from England, so I've done lots of field work out there. That's my wife serving as a scale bar. There she is again, serving as a scale bar in a quarry in Scotland. And again, there was loads of trilobites in there. a somewhat less beautiful field assistant there. There's one of my students, Ryan, and he was my field assistant doing some field work in Spain. So I'm fortunate enough to have gone out and collected trilobites from all over the world, Europe, North America especially, collecting trilobites to study their evolutionary history. So what I want to spend just a few minutes talking to you about now is some of that research, showing you how we can use all these fossils that I've collected from all over the place to understand things about trilobite evolution. The first thing I want to talk to you about is a microevolutionary story. This is a very sort of short evolutionary story, short-term evolution, spanning only about 1 million years of trilobite evolutionary history. But it's interesting because it shows how, if you go out and collect the fossils, you can really understand not only how the trilobites are evolving over time, but we can also start getting at the drivers behind that evolution. We can actually start inferring things about why, not just how, but why the trilobites were evolving. So I want to talk about this one first, and then if there's time at the end, which there may not be, I'll talk some more about a bigger evolutionary pattern involving thoracic segments. But first, I want to talk about some work I've done in the desert Southwest. So here we are, there's Las Vegas, this is Nevada and California, and all of these symbols here, the squares and X's and triangles, those are all my field localities that I've been out to. And at each of these field sites, I go out there and I measure the rocks, I work out what the different rock types are, and I come up with these very high resolution, very detailed measured sections showing the different rock layers from old at the bottom to young at the top. And each of these very fine black bars, it looks like a barcode here, each of these very fine black bars is a different fossil level from which I collected trilobites. So you can see through this roughly 20 meter interval, which spans about 1 million years of geologic time, roughly speaking, I've got almost continuous sampling through this 20 meter interval. And I did that not just at one place like the Marble Mountains, but at every one of these localities for this same 1 million year interval at very high resolution. So I collected a lot of trilobites in this 1 million year interval in everything from near shore environments to offshore environments in the lower Cambrian. These rocks are all lower Cambrian age. And what I want to talk to you about just for the next few minutes is a story that I found as I was collecting these trilobites that sort of unraveled as I was collecting these trilobites, involving this beautiful looking trilobite genus called Bristolia. This is a very primitive group of trilobites. They belong to the Olenellid group of trilobites, one of the most basal and stratigraphically oldest group of trilobites. There are 5 species of Bristolia within that 20 meter interval that I collected. There's pictures of all 5 shown here. They are beautiful looking animals with these big outrageous spines coming off the side of the head, often sprouting out sideways. Big third thoracic segment, again with a big spine sticking out to the side in all of these guys. But these, you can see there's 5 different species shown here. The thoraxes are all very similar, so I won't talk about that right now. But if you look at the head shields, the cephalons of these things, you can see that they have very different head shapes. And that's what I want to focus on because that's what was evolving in this group of trilobites. All the head shields differ from one species to the other in just 2 features. And I just want to draw your attention to what these 2 features are. The first feature is the sort of angle that the back of the head makes. You can see from the middle bit of the head here where the glabella is, the back of the head shoots out sideways and then kinks forward at some kind of angle to where the base of this spine sticks out. The spine is called the genal spine. And one thing that we're interested in that differentiates these 5 species of trilobites is how strong this little kink in the back of the head is. We call this thing, it has a fancy name, the adgenal angle. It's just the strength of this angle down here. You can see in this particular species here, it makes about a 45-degree angle or so. Okay, so that's one feature that distinguishes the species. The other feature that distinguishes these 5 species from each other is how far up the side of the head the genal spine sprouts from. You can see that on this species here, if you measure a line from the back of the head to the front of the head, we're going to call that the glabella length. The glabella is the structure in the middle of the head here. So we can measure the glabella length, and we can also measure this distance here which is the distance from opposite the back of the glabella to where the genal spine sprouts. And the ratio of that length to that length tells us how far up the side of the head this spine was sprouting from. You can see on this trilobite, this particular specimen, it's from almost halfway up the side of the head, okay? So bear in mind, try to remember those two features of the head. All right, there are 5 species of Bristolia. The first of which we'll talk about is this one, Bristolia perrii. It's actually a new species. I've yet to actually publish this name, but that's what I'm going to call it. And this one, you can see the entire trilobite here. This is just the head of one here. You can see that the kink on the back of the head is really quite subtle. I mean, it's there, but it's not very strong. And you can also see that the genal spines are not very well advanced forward. They're sprouting out from almost opposite the back end of the head. Okay, so it's a fairly ordinary looking trilobite if you just look at the head, shape of the head. This one here is the second species we'll talk about. This is Bristolia mohavensis. And if you look at the head shield of this specimen or of this specimen here, you can see that the kink on the back of the head is a little bit bigger, a little bit more exaggerated than it was on the first species. And the spines sprout out from a bit further forward up the side of the head than they did in that first species. The third species is this one here, Bristolia harringtoni, and it continues this kind of trend. The adgenal angle, that's the strength of the kink in the back of the head, is a little bit stronger, and the spines are now sticking out from almost halfway up the side of the head. The fourth species continues that trend again. This is Bristolia bristolensis, and its head shield is almost sort of pentagonal to almost square in some specimens, or rectangular in some specimens. The angle on the back of the head is now approaching 90 degrees. It's about 80 to 90 degrees. Sometimes it can get a little bit more than 90 degrees. And the genal spines sprout out from, again, about the middle of the head to sometimes about 2/3 of the way up the side of the head. And then the final species is this one. This is crazy. This is Bristolia insolens. And you can see that the head now, this angle on the back of the head, is so big, it's more than 90 degrees. The head actually narrows towards the base of the genal spine. So the head is actually shaped like a trapezoid in this trilobite. And the genal spine, so the adgenal angle is now really big. It's a lot more than 90 degrees. And the genal spines are these things sticking from way out the front end of the head. Genal spines normally stick out from the back of the head. In this trilobite, they're sticking out from the front end of the head. So the genal spines are now really strongly advanced to the front end of the head. Okay, so those are the 5 species, and those are the sort of features that we use to tell these species apart. Now, historically, those species have been named or recognized as being distinct from each other. And people have even done some basic kind of measurements on the head. They've measured that kink in the back of the head. They've measured how far up the base, how far up the head the genal spines are sprouting from. And they found good statistical support for those 5 species being different from each other. But I've done a lot more field work than other people have done in this region. And I've collected a lot more specimens, and I've found quite a different story. And that's what I want to tell you about right now. So for starters, let's just take these 2 species. These 2 are quite similar. This is Bristolia harringtoni and Bristolia bristolensis, the 3rd and the 4th ones that I was just talking to you about. Historically, people have measured the strength of the angle on the back of this species and on the back of this species. They found that this species has this angle in here ranging from 45 to 65 degrees. And in this species, it ranges from 75 to just over 90 degrees. And therefore, there's a gap between 65 and 75 degrees with a big break. There's nothing between 65 and 75 degrees. And they've said, okay, that's a good criterion for recognizing that as one species and that as a different species, okay? And that's perfectly good data, right? When you go to the museum collections on which these species were named, and you measure the strength of that angle, adgenal angle, and you plot the data up from the smallest angle up to the largest angle up here, you can see there's a cluster of specimens down here ranging from about 45 to 65 degrees. That's the first species, Bristolia harringtoni. Then there's a gap from about 65 to 75 degrees. And from 75 degrees up to about 90 or 95 degrees, that's where your second group of data is. And that's that second species, Bristolia bristolensis, right? So the museum specimens, and there's almost 100 specimens gone into this, support the fact that there are two distinct species in there. But I went out and collected a lot more specimens when I was doing all field work. And so I've now got a lot more than just 91 specimens. When you add not only those 91 specimens, when you add to that the new collections and plot the data for the adgenal angle values for what should be those two species between about 45 and 95 degrees, this is what you get. You completely fill in that gap between them. There is nothing about this feature, the adgenal angle, that suggests that Harringtoni should be distinct from bristolensis. So the extra field work has filled in the gap. And whereas we thought we had two species here, now it looks like, well, where would you draw a species break in there? There's really nothing to suggest there's more than one species in there. It's one continuum of values from 45 all the way up to about 90 or 100 degrees. When you add, oh, I should say that was based on over 400 specimens, right? When you add in, when you focus on all of those 5 species of Bristolia, not just the 2 Harringtoni and bristolensis, when you plot data that represent all 5 of those species, what you actually see is for this variable, the adgenal angle, that's the, the strength of the angle in the back of the head here. What you actually see is that there are really only 2 clusters of specimens. You've got one continuous range of variation from about 30 degrees all the way up to about 100 degrees. Then, and 4 species of Bristolia should be distinguishable along there, and they're not. Then you've got a bit of a gap, and that 5th species, which is the really weird one with the trapezoidal-shaped head, trapezoidal-shaped head, Bristolia insolens, that really is a distinct species. That's well broken out, well separated from all the others. So I've got no problem with that one being a distinct species, but the problem is that there's supposed to be 4 species along here, and when you measure enough specimens, almost 600 specimens here, you don't see that. Okay, so what's going on here? How many species do we actually have? And what's going on in this sort of gradation now from one species through another, through another, through another? What's going on there? Oh, I should point out that that same pattern holds up not just for the adgenal angle, the strength of the kink in the back of the head, but also for that other trait that I told you about is supposed to distinguish the species, how far up the side of the head the spines sprout from, right? There's supposed to be 5 species along here, and there aren't, right? I mean, there's one continuous gradation of values that represent 4 of those species. Then you've got a break, and the 5th one, again, that Bristolia insolens, which is the one where the spines are right at the front of the head, that one is clearly distinct. But again, 4 of the 5 species, there's no basis for recognizing them as different species there. So what is going on? These things are really grading from one species into another imperceptibly. And it really seems that we may have actually caught evolution in the act here. We are actually finding the intermediates that bridge the gap between named species that were originally thought to be very distinct from each other. So what we can now do, because I've got so many specimens that I've collected from the field outcrops, I know exactly what layer these trilobites came from. We can now start plotting their morphology against stratigraphic level or geologic time, right? So this is 1 million years or about 20 meters of rock, okay? And what we're showing now is the value of adgenal angle, that's the strength of this kink in the back of the head, as a function of time. And what you can see is this is why we get that complete gradation. There's a very gradual trend in the lower part of the section from low adgenal angles up to high adgenal angles with all intermediates filled in. There's no breaks in that distribution whatsoever. And what's really interesting is that this trend then reverses on itself from about the middle of this time interval back up to the top of this time interval. So we have this sort of banana or boomerang shaped evolutionary trend through time in the adgenal angle. And I will also show you, or I'll tell you, I don't have a plot of this, that the other feature, the strength, how far up the side of the head the spines were sprouting from, shows exactly the same pattern. What's really interesting is that on this banana-shaped trend, right where the apex is, that's where we have this bizarre species, Bristolia insolens, making its first and only appearance. That bizarre species only occurs right here in the middle bit of the stratigraphic section, okay? So we have a banana-shaped trend involving 4 of the 5 species with all intermediates filled in. And then we've got what seems to be just one branching speciation event, which is the evolution of this other species, insolens, from right about the apex of that evolutionary trend, okay? So this is really interesting. We've documented gradual evolution going on involving 4 species, and we've also pinned down where a speciation event actually happened, a branching speciation event actually happened to produce a fifth named species right there. Okay, so this is really cool. We found something that nobody else had realized. But what is even cooler, we're not only documenting the evolutionary pattern here, we can also start getting to terms with what might have been driving that evolutionary pattern. When we look at the rocks in which the fossils are entombed, we can start seeing sedimentary features in those rocks that give us indications about water depth. And what's really cool is the shallowest water is right down here at the bottom end of this pile of rocks. In fact, you're basically on a beach front environment right there. And as you go up through the lower half of the section, the water, the environment was progressively deepening. So sea level was rising through here. The deepest sea level was achieved right here in the middle of this stack of rocks. That's what we call in technical terms, the maximum flooding interval. And then throughout the upper half of this section of rocks, at all of these localities, there's good evidence that sea level was falling again. And in fact, it ends up on a beach-like environment again, right at the top, with actually an erosion surface suggesting that things were subaerially exposed. It was actually land. So we have, through this interval of time at all of these localities, we've got a deepening to shallowing sea trend as well, sea level trend. So what we can do now is perhaps relate these two things together and suggest that it was the deepening to shallowing of the seawater that was driving this evolutionary pattern. And the trilobites were adapting to ever deepening water and then progressively shallowing water again. And that's why we get this sort of banana-shaped evolutionary trend. So we can not only document gradual evolution occurring, but we can also relate it to the environment that was driving that evolution. And right at the time where the maximum water depth was achieved, that's where this bizarre species Bristolia insolens appears or evolves, right associated with the deepest water environment. So we think now we've not only documented this pattern, but we've also explained it in terms of a driving factor behind it. So again, just to sort of drive this home, I'll sort of walk you through this million years of geologic time and hopefully show you graphically what was going on. So in the shallowest water, down at the bottom end of the section, we have this species down here with very weak adgenal angles and barely advanced genal spines. And that seems to be an adaptation to shallow water. We'll talk about why coming up. Through time, for about the first 500,000 years, sea level was deepening. So this is a time of general sea level rise. And what happens is the trilobite lineage, and there is only one lineage going on through here, gradually and progressively changed the outline of its head shield, progressively, gradually increasing the strength of this kink and gradually, progressively moving these spines further forward. It goes through what we would call, or what had been named, Bristolia mohavensis. It then evolves very gradually into something that had been called Bristolia harringtoni. And that trend continues, becomes more exaggerated, again, with all gradational steps filled in, into what had been called Bristolia bristolensis. We're now in more or less the deepest water part of the section, deepest water part of this time interval, and we have the only actual branching evolutionary event, and that's of this guy with the trapezoidal head appearing, which co-occurs stratigraphically with what had been called Bristolia bristolensis. So now we have two species represented, but this one is only there in the really deep water time. As soon as sea level started shallowing again, this one seems to have gone extinct. When we move then into the upper part of the section, we're starting with the one that's that had been called Bristolia bristolensis, but now we're in, for the next 500,000 years or so, we're in a time of sea level drop, sea level fall, and this evolutionary trend started reversing on itself. So we had something that had been called bristolensis. It goes back through almost sort of re-evolving the morphology of what had been called Bristolia harringtoni. So we have a stratigraphically low and a stratigraphically high version of Bristolia harringtoni, but it is never known anywhere from the intervening interval when we get this other morphotype coming in. And the trend then goes all the way back to this one here, which is the new species, Bristolia perii. And that one, again, just like the first species, Bristolia mohavensis, has very weak adgenal angle and genal spines that spread out from the back of the head. So we've got this complete gradational sequence, this banana-shaped evolutionary trend, really well documented, and we think we know what was going on. So this is the kind of stuff that my research focuses on. Now, in terms of why that evolutionary trend may have emerged, what I think, this is speculative, and somebody should go out and actually try to model this by building models of these things. What I think is that these trilobites are actually evolving their head shield shape to basically stop themselves sinking into the mud. As sea level deepens, the seafloor changes from being very sandy to very muddy to really muddy, flocculent, kind of very soft muds in the very deep water. And the trilobites could have potentially sunk through that mud, and they want to be crawling around on the surface of the mud. So what they do is they evolve in the deeper water, muddier seafloor environments. They actually evolve these spines that not just droop backwards down the length of the body, but flare out to the side of the head. And they're actually operating these spines like snowshoes. They are distributing the weight of the animal over a bigger square foot of seafloor, as it were, a bigger area of seafloor, and therefore stopping the trilobite from sinking into the mud. And so if you look at the sort of the trilobites that don't have the the snowshoe shaped heads, it's this one, and those are the ones that occur in the shallowest water environments at the bottom and at the top of the section. And then you've got things like this and this in the medium water depth parts. And in the deepest water parts, you've got this one where the spines sprout out from the very front of the head. And you can see from this, they curve all the way around. They actually terminate right there. The genal spines run from the front of the head, looping all the way around and project beyond the back end of the body. And this thing, I think, is a great adaptation to stop sinking into the mud. So we've got an evolutionary trend, very well documented, showing all gradational steps in between. Got either of this, which is sea level change, and we can even at least speculate on why this evolutionary trend makes sense. It's because perhaps the trilobites were adapting to a different kind of substrate, a different kind of seafloor texture, and they wanted to stop sinking into it. Okay, so I've gone on for long enough. That was about an hour's talk there. I don't think I'll get into the second thing I wanted to talk about, which is segmentation, because that would take about another 10 or 15 minutes. So I think I'll stop there. But that's hopefully given you some, hopefully, interesting insight into the kind of work that I do. A lot of field work, a lot of collecting of trilobites, measuring of the trilobites, and then really trying to understand how they were evolving and the biological and environmental reasons for that evolution. So I'll stop there, and I will be perfectly happy to take any questions that anybody may have. Stop sharing so we can see each other.
Are you going to continue more of it next time of the trilobites to us?
I would be happy to give another talk some night where I could talk to you about other aspects of my research. Absolutely. Yeah, I'll be happy to do that.
Mark, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, this is fascinating.
Good. Well, thank you. I'm glad you like it. Yeah, yeah. It's hopefully an inspiration for everybody to go out and collect some more trilobites now. So I hope to be able to join you on one of your trips in the not too distant future.
Yeah, we don't have any need for more inspiration for collecting trilobites.
No, I'm sure you don't. Like I said, I'm preaching to the choir here. Yeah.
Yeah, the problem, of course, is that because of the rock types we have here, so much dolomite and everything
Yeah.
being preserved as a steinkorn,
Yes.
we lose so much detail.
Not
Absolutely. Yeah.
in the Galena, I agree with you, but there are some flat-bill trilobites I've collected that actually have chitin on them,
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
and it is
Oh,
it's still in dolostone.
Right. Right.
But,
right. Yeah. In much of, well, I mean, you guys know much more firsthand about this than I do, but in northeastern and northern Illinois, the trilobites are pretty poorly preserved in these dolomites where it's just kind of a vuggy, moldic kind of preservation.
Yeah.
There are some much better trilobites in southern Illinois, but it's also, it's not far to drive down to Indiana, Ohio, the tri-state area around there. You can get into beautiful Ordovician rocks, Michigan basin. In Michigan, within just a couple of hours drive, you can be collecting absolutely, trophy quality trilobites.
Well, unfortunately, the best Ordovician site, the Dixon site, which produced unbelievable trilobites. The whole cement plant is closing. They moved the crusher out. But I do have one question on the systems tracks. I've always
sure, yeah.
I've always wondered about systems tracks, and at the bottom where the sea level was coming in, it's called the transgressive system track.
That's correct. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Then when the sea level falls, why isn't it called the regressive systems tract?
Okay, so that is a very good question, and it's one that I wrestled with as well when I was going through college. I never understood that either. So when you talk about a transgression, that is a sea level rise, so that makes sense, right? The column of water where you're standing is getting deeper, right? So it's the transgressive systems tract. That makes sense. Now, when you talk about a regression, that has a much more precise meaning than perhaps people realize. A regression is where sea level itself is falling. Okay, so sea level is dropping, presumably because ice caps are growing on the poles and all that seawater is getting trapped in the ice or whatever. So there is less water in the oceans. Sea level is falling. That is the strict definition of a regression, right?
So it's more of a global thing.
Well, yes, but it's more to do with an absolute change in sea level itself, right? But you can also decrease the depth of the water column above you by piling sediment on the seafloor. Even if sea level remains exactly where it was, doesn't raise, doesn't fall, if sea level stays exactly where it is, but you bring in a bunch of sediment and pile it on the seafloor, the seafloor is going to rise up and put you in shallower water environment, right? That is not a regression because sea level isn't actually falling,
right,
but it's still a sort of drop in relative sea level. So when we talk about, we don't use the word regressive systems tract, because all we're saying, we use the word high stand systems tract, and that's to sort of, it's a more general term for a shallowing of sea level, relative shallowing of sea level, but it could be because sea level is actually falling. It could also be a relative fall in sea level because sediments are piling up.
And the depth of the water changes.
And the depth of the water changes as a result. Yes, yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
So it's a subtle but
Yeah,
terminologically important distinction. Yeah, yeah.
super.
Good, all right.
And again, great talk.
Well, thank you, thank you. I'm glad you liked it. Yeah, yeah. An excuse to just show a bunch of trilobites.
So is
I'm happy to do that anytime.
Is the function of the genal spine always the same in all trilobites?
Well, so I mean, it's guesswork. We have no idea. I mean, you know, we don't know for sure. Most genal spines probably just had a defensive function. So they project just backwards off the side of the head, projecting backwards, and probably served as a warning to any predators that were maybe going to bite into the trilobites. And of course, if the trilobite enrolled into a ball, the spines would have projected out of the ball and therefore, you know, perhaps speared a potential predator, or at least made the trilobite look bigger. So it would have required a bigger predator to eat the thing. So most genal spines, I think people imagine, were defensive in nature. However, there are trilobites that have genal spines like the ones I've shown you today that really sprouted out sideways and just curved around the entire body. Now, those may have been defensive, but also they could easily have served as a feature to distribute the weight of the trilobites, the snowshoe hypothesis. Some other trilobites, including some of the ones I showed you very early in the talk, had the big sort of coiled spines sprouting off the back of the body. And those things could have been for sexual ornamentation, for display purposes. Many modern day arthropods like stag beetles and things like that evolved these very ornate spines, big spines projecting in all different directions and sometimes coiling around for display purposes to attract a mate. So it's entirely possible that genal spines could, at least in some trilobites, could have also served a display purpose. But you know, your guess is as good as mine. You know, this rapidly sort of devolves into speculation. The thing is, you know, how could we actually test that hypothesis? So, you know, we need somebody to come along and actually build models of these trilobites, realistic models of these trilobites at the right scale, and see if the snowshoe hypothesis makes sense. Does it actually stop the thing from sinking into the mud? So, you know, some of this thing, you know, we can come up with ideas, but eventually somebody's going to need to actually test those ideas.
Is anybody looking at other species of trilobites to see if this is happening within the other, you know, the other groupings?
Well, people have tried. The thing is, it is a massive amount of work to go and collect at more or less a centimeter scale through 20 meters of section at about 30 localities. That took years of my life to do that when I was going through graduate school. So it's a huge undertaking to do, and there is no guarantee that you're going to find anything. I mean, you know, you could spend years of your life sampling at that level of resolution and find that the trilobites don't change at all through that 20 meters of section, you know. So I think it was just sheer luck that I stumbled, you know, I sort of had the enthusiasm and the time to do the collecting. And quite early on in that collecting, I realized, oh, there's something really interesting going on here. I'm finding specimens that seem to bridge the gap between what had up until then thought to have been just discrete species, distinct species. So that was encouraging, and it gave me the willpower to continue that for, you know, what was ultimately about a 4-year project. People have tried doing very detailed collecting like that in other places, in the Cambrian, all the way through to certainly up to the Carboniferous. I don't know about the Permian. So people have tried, but without really the same degree of success as that. I think they were just unlucky in where they were collecting. People have found very small gradual evolution in things like thoracic segment number. There was some classic papers by Peter Sheldon in the 1980s documenting that kind of thing. So people have found similar kinds of things, but nothing, I'm biased, of course, nothing quite as exciting as what I think this is, where you can really tie it into an environmental change and the functional morphology of the trilobites too. But that's not to say they're not out there. You know, I mean, I would love it if there were other examples of this kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm going to ask another question. I don't mean to, you know, step ahead of anybody else. You mentioned giving it a different name, but if we're talking about wouldn't, and I just finished reading trilobites.
Oh, so, yeah, right, yeah.
Wouldn't it go back to the original species name, or Now that you're, or is it?
Yeah,
still
it would. So
recognized as 5?
you're absolutely right. What I gave you there was a somewhat slightly simplified version of what's actually going on. The trilobite at the very top of that section is not an exact mirror of the one at the bottom. In terms of its head shield outline, it more or less is. But there's also, do you remember the glabella, the feature in the middle of the head, that segmented thing in the middle of the head? The glabella also changes over this 20 million year interval, but it does so in a unidirectional trend. It does not banana back to where it was.
Yeah.
So actually, in terms of the head shield, the one at the top and the one at the bottom, the head shield outline, you would basically say, yeah, that would have to be called the same species. You wouldn't describe it as something new. But it actually, the one at the top actually has a different shaped glabella to the one at the bottom. And so that's what I'm using to call a different species. Okay. So what I will hold up my hands and say that I did oversimplify things a little bit. And you can actually, if you pulled out a trilobite from the top and the trilobite from the bottom, and you were to allow me to look at things other than just the outline of the head shield, I would be able to tell you which one was which. Okay. So that's justification for calling it a different name. Right? The tricky bit, though, for the vast majority of those species, except that unique one that's in the middle of the pile with the really weird shaped head, the tricky bit is actually going to be diagnosing the species when I'm naming this thing as a new species, coming up with a feature that is sufficiently distinct between it and all the others, because it's just a continuous spectrum. And so it does become very hard to do that. And although that is the one reason why I, as of yet, haven't published this work and that named that new species, is because I haven't yet quite worked out exactly where to call the cutoff between these things. So this work I did 10, 15 years ago, and it's still not actually published. You were just looking at unpublished information there. But I'm hoping to get it out by the end of the year.
It's got to drive you nuts, that much work. And
it does.
Not being able to move
it.
Yeah.
No, having so many specimens available is both a beautiful situation to be in, but also a really painful situation to be in, because the more you see, the more you learn, the harder it gets. When you have only 2 specimens and they look different from each other, it's easy. You call them different names. But when you've got 100 specimens and they grade from one to the other, what do you do with that? So it's very tricky, but fun. I wouldn't have it any other way.
So you talked about the sediment as being the depth of the sediment, the thickness of the sediment as being sort of a driver for the growth of the repositioning and growth of the genal spine.
Yeah, well, the muddiness of the sediment.
The muddiness.
Yeah, the muddiness of the sediment. Yeah.
But it also that the type of sediment indicates something about the energy of the water.
Yes.
And so much finer sediment has to be much less energy.
Yes.
And so a structure that looks to me to be rather fragile can exist, where if it was in a higher energy setting, the trilobite probably couldn't get away with growing this large genal spine because it would be broken off, and then whatever adaptive advantage it provides is gone at that
That
point.
is also true, yes. Now, that is difficult to test. It's certainly plausible. It's certainly as good an explanation as any of the others that I threw out at you there. It could well be that these things, the very delicate spines, or at least the spines that flare out sideways, are perhaps more fragile, more prone to breakage, and just wouldn't function well in deep water. So that is also perhaps a reason why you don't get those things in shallow water. It doesn't necessarily explain why they evolved in the deep water, but it is a reason perhaps why they're not there in shallow water. There are other trilobites through this whole interval, things other than just Bristolia. So there are several other trilobites that range through this, none of which show the same kind of trend as the Bristolia ones do. and they all retain the sort of normal genal spines that just stick straight back. So that's interesting. Not everybody does this. There was something about Bristolia that kind of showed this adaptation that the other trilobites didn't. So that's interesting and something that I need to think more about. And then there are certainly other adaptations that closely related trilobites to Bristolia show in shallow water settings. Trilobites often become, well, not often, but sometimes become very effaced and smooth looking in shallow water settings relative to deep water settings. And some shallow water trilobites at the top of this pile of rocks I were looking at, that's where they start becoming very effaced and smooth looking. So there are other groups of trilobites through this, some of which do show adaptations to deep water versus shallow water, kind of like Bristolia do, and others of which don't. And it's a fascinating question to know, or to try to work out why some show these adaptations and others don't. That's going to keep me busy for the next 10 years.
So trilobites, we certainly have trilobite tracks preserved in places, but at the same time, some of our sediments here, our upper Ordovician sediments here, are heavily bioturbated. And without fish, or presumably we don't have fish here, the fish are elsewhere, we don't really have much as a candidate for doing that bioturbation, except maybe trilobites.
If you look at Dennis's book, there's an enormous amount of trace fossils that indicate there's a possibility of an enormous number of soft-bodied animals doing just that.
That's right. Yeah. So, trilobites definitely throughout their entire evolutionary history left behind trackways and footprints and even little burrows that we call Rusophycus. So they did leave behind trace fossils, but the vast majority of those trace fossils, virtually all of those trace fossils that trilobites leave behind, are on the surface of the sediment. Trilobites just like to crawl around on the surface. The vast majority of trace fossils, the kinds of bioturbation that you're talking about there, are actually burrows below the sediment surface. And the organisms that do that, both now in the modern day world and in the past, are things like soft-bodied worms. The seafloor would have been just crawling, absolutely littered with soft-bodied worms, burrowing down through the sediment and churning it all up. And that's what's giving you the vast majority of trace fossils, especially below the surface, and causing all of that bioturbation. Now, things do change through time. In the Cambrian, the bioturbation is much less. So there were worms around, but they weren't churning the sediment to the same degree as they are, for example, in the Ordovician all the way through to the present. And trace fossil workers have documented that kind of pattern. So the Cambrian, again, is this weird time where animals, it's almost like animals are just kind of learning to do their thing. And once you get beyond the Cambrian, they've kind of learned it by that time. So the Cambrian is this great time of experimentation where animals are trying to do their stuff. But by the time you get into the Ordovician rocks, like around here, there's extensive bioturbation. Some of it was and would have been produced by trilobites. The vast majority of it would have been produced by worms and soft-bodied organisms that have no business themselves being in the fossil record. But their trackways, trails, and burrows certainly are. So we have this record of their behavior, even if we don't have a record of the actual organism itself. There were fish during the Ordovician, the earliest fish of Cambrian. So yeah, there would have been fish swimming around the seas covering what's now Illinois. Very early fish, but there would have been fish.
Yeah, I don't know of any scales really proven to be from fish like they have scales out in Colorado or in other places.
That's right. I think the
like
depositional environment isn't good for the preservation of them there, but I don't see any reason why there wouldn't have been fish swimming around the seas of Illinois in the Ordovician. They're just probably not getting preserved. But in other settings, as you said, Colorado, lots of other places in Ordovician rocks, you do get the scales preserved and you get all the jawless fishes coming.
That assumes that the fish have adapted to marine. They may not have yet adapted to marine conditions. I think a lot of the early
I believe the earliest fish are marine. But
Okay,
then much of the diversification of fish in like the mid-Paleozoic seems to have been in freshwater.
Yeah.
So, you know, that may have been going on. But the earliest fish, I believe, I'm not a fish person, but the earliest fish, I believe, are from the Cambrian, and they are marine.
Well, that would be from the Burgess and Xinjiang. It would be.
Yes, yeah. So there's chordates there.
Marine, yeah,
Sort of looking a bit fishy.
Yeah, I think I'm not a vertebrate person, but I think those fish down in Colorado they're in red beds and they're red sediments, and I think they might be freshwater.
They could be,
Yeah.
they could be, but certainly the fish from the Cambrian are marine.
Yeah.
Well, it'd be great if you could come out in the field sometime when we
I would love to. Absolutely.
are in a place where there are trilobites. We don't have access to some of the quarries because of COVID, and I certainly hope that will change, but we never have any guarantee year to year about quarry access,
Of course,
because
yeah,
that's
that's
just
right.
the way it goes.
Yeah.
And we don't really have any public collecting areas for Ordovician. You know,
Right.
we just have one, and hopefully someday a second one for Carboniferous, and
Yeah.
that's about it.
Yeah, right. And that sounds great. Everywhere I have lived throughout my entire life, I've always interacted very much with the local fossil groups. So I would love to establish a good working relationship with ESCONI too, now that I'm here in Chicago. It's long overdue. I should have reached out to you guys years ago. But I would love to do that, and I would be happy to join you on field trip collections and set you guys collecting homework assignments and things. That's what I've done in the past. So I would love to find one of these. Can you guys go out and find it? I would love to enroll you as collaborators in my research, and I'll tell you about some other research projects in future meetings.
No pun intended. Enroll.
And yes, yes, absolutely, yes.
Bada bing.
Mark,
Yeah.
I have a couple quick questions for you.
Sure.
You had some Carboniferous trilobites. Whereabouts are those coming from?
Those are southern Illinois. There are actually some, I'm going to call them reefs, but it's not actually technically the correct word. They're Walsortian mud banks.
Oh, yeah.
But there are some reef deposits in the very southern tip of southern Illinois. I'm blanking on the name of the place, but I've read publications about it. And there they have really quite diverse communities of Mississippian marine communities with these sort of reef-like structures, not built by corals, but built by other things. And there's just loaded with crinoids and brachiopods and all these other things in southern Illinois. So that's and I used to collect the same kinds of things when I lived in England. The rocks that I grew up on were of the same kind of reefy-like things. They're only found in the lower Carboniferous. So those are well worth exploring. If we or you could get access into those things, that'd be.
So
that'd be
those are in quarries and not road cuts then?
I believe it's a quarry. I'll dig out the literature on that, and I can perhaps email it to you and see if you can still get access to that. But I know that the quarry owners have historically let groups in because people have led field trips around to those places. So it'd be a few hours drive. It'd be like probably a weekend trip rather than just a day.
Trilobites are known from the Carboniferous rocks in Lone Star too, and those correspond to the same time period around Kansas City.
Yeah, right, yeah. And all through the cyclothems that we've got, even in northern Illinois, around Mason Creek, right? Whenever you have the cyclothems, in the marine layers of the cyclothems, you get thin little limestones. Those do yield trilobites with a bit of work. They're not common, but they're in there. They're not going to be spectacular looking things. But the project I'm working on right now, which I didn't have time to talk about tonight, but again, I'll perhaps come back if I'm invited to a future talk later on, is looking at all of trilobite evolutionary history, all the way through to the Carboniferous and even into the Permian. And so I've been going through, for example, the Field Museum collections for all summer. I've been up at the Field Museum when it's been open, looking through their collections behind the scenes, and they've got some amazing trilobites from Illinois, from the Carboniferous, in the limestone beds there. So there's going to be some localities, hopefully still in existence, that might be worth digging around in.
Pertaining to some of the trilobites that you found in out west, did you have any preservation of the underside with the legs and mouth parts?
Not there. So I'm collaborating. So at a couple of sites that I've worked at in Canada, in British Columbia, near the Burgess Shale, but in older rocks in the lower Cambrian, we have actually now found, although it's not published, so I probably shouldn't tell you this, but we have actually found trilobites with appendages there in the lower Cambrian. But nothing in the southwestern US in the lower Cambrian. There are some in the middle Cambrian that have like Burgess Shale equivalent rocks in Utah, you know, the Wheeler Shale and the Spence Shale, that you get appendages on those things. But in the lower Cambrian, the only ones in all of North America that bear appendages are in British Columbia. There's one in Pennsylvania in the Appalachians, and there's one in North Greenland, and that's it. And I'm working on the ones from British Columbia right now.
One last thing. Is there a possibility you can do a summary and provide it to us for our newsletter?
Sure, like a little kind of abstract or something of the talk. Absolutely, yeah. I'll put one together. Yeah.
Okay, greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, I can totally do that. And I'll email that to Dave, I guess.
Yeah.
You know,
It'll get to the right people.
Yeah, okay. All right, I'll do that. Not a problem.
Cool.
Do you have any really cool specimens you'd like to contribute for a Fossil Friday post? I don't know if you look at our website, but
unfortunately, well, I mean, I can show you pictures of trilobites.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I'm not asking. Yeah, I'm not asking for the specimen. I'm asking.
Okay, all right, yeah.
Picture.
No, I can.
Sorry. If you want to send it, I'll take pictures.
I've got literally thousands of photographs of trilobites on my computer. So yeah, I can drown you under pictures of trilobites if you want some. So yeah, I can email you those. That's no problem.
Awesome. Thank you.
The specimens themselves, I've got to keep hold of because they don't belong to me. That's the thing about being a university professor. You've got to give everything you have to museums. You don't get to keep any of it for yourself.
Maybe I wasn't trying hard enough when other people sort of made contributions for our Fossil Friday. I should have asked for the specimens, and I take pictures.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. You're building your own collection. Yeah,
exactly.
Nope.
Yeah, we don't want to get into talking about who's found trilobites and who hasn't.
Oh, I sense there's a bit of history there. So
you know, it's actually they're fairly common out at the Irene quarry that we go to near Belvedere. They're just in the galena, and so it's all steinkerns, and so you just don't have much detail. You know?
Yeah.
Kathleen, are you going to Braceville?
Yes.
Okay, I'll have a surprise for you.
Oh.
Not the same as finding one, but hey, I'm not going to turn it down.
They're not complete, but they're from Delta.
Yeah, many people here have been out to Delta, out in the Wheeler Shale, and
yeah, I've been there. Yeah, that's one of my middle Cambrian field sites around there.
Yeah. Interesting place.
Right. Oh, it is. That's spectacular. Yeah.
No nautiloids, so why go?
Yeah.
Well, Mark, I really like to say thank you. I really appreciate your talk.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
Give some applause going.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure. Anytime at all.
I do have one other question.
Sure.
Of course. A lot of the books I've been reading, even about the Burgess Shale and all that, the history, there seems to be a lot of resistance, or early on, there was a lot of resistance to theories that changed some of the standard thinking. Have you come across a lot of resistance to when you were first approaching this, what you were discovering?
Not with this, because most of the people that described all of those species that I'm now saying are all kind of basically one species just gradually evolving, they're all long dead. So they're not going to, argue with me. I think most people are actually, most paleontologists that are aware of this work, again, it's not published yet, so we'll see what happens when it gets published. But most of the people that are aware of this are actually, quite relieved about it and quite happy about it because, we know how evolution works, right? It's descent with modification. It's, ever since Darwin, right? It's this sort of gradual evolution. And so it's nice to be able to find one or a few examples where you can really see that going on in the fossil record, right? Because the fossil record is very patchy. And what that gives you is gaps between things. And you say that this evolved into that, but because of the nature of the fossil record, there's always going to be a gap. Or, well, I mean, there's almost always going to be a gap. So it's really nice to actually, be able to point to this example that I showed you tonight, and just a handful of others in the fossil record, where you can really see, that sort of Darwinian evolution going on from all intermediate steps are there, and there's no gaps whatsoever. So I think the paleontological community at large, at least the ones that I've, that have heard me give talks about this kind of thing, have sort of like been, phew, yeah, okay, he's actually found something that for a long time we were really hoping, expecting to be out there, but it's just really hard to find. So I've not met any resistance with this, but on the other hand, I'm not surprised about that because this fits absolutely with the predictions of Darwinian evolution, and it's therefore not really kind of upending anything. The only people it would ever upset is if people like the names of the trilobites, that I'm going to have to basically say, there's not 4 species here, there's only 1 or 2, right? So I don't think this is going to create any bad feelings. The bad feelings arise because, some people come out with outrageous ideas that don't fit people's expectations about things, and therefore there's resistance to that. And sometimes, those kind of, wild and wacky ideas are exactly that, and they don't gain any traction, and eventually data come along that refute them and sort of put them back in their place. And just occasionally, those wild and wacky ideas, start gathering momentum, and before long they are the mainstream, so it's, but this kind of stuff that I talked about tonight, that is not going to revolutionize anything. It's not going to revolutionize our understanding of evolution. It's completely, in line with our understanding of evolution. It's just a relief to actually find it for a change.
Yeah, but Mark, it does bring out one point, the value of field work, the
Absolutely.
value of systematists, which we're losing.
Yep.
And the data speaks for itself. It is what it is.
Yep. That's absolutely true. Yep. That is absolutely true. And there are, dwindling numbers of paleontologists, period. But then, especially paleontologists who enjoy and can do field work and enjoy and do this kind of detailed, systematic, specimen-based work. The numbers are dwindling. So, there are a few of us. I think in the last few years, there's been a few hires at universities in America, in the US, and also elsewhere in the world of specimen-based and field-based paleontologists. So we're not completely going extinct just yet. And, of course, I'm training students all the time, PhD students in my lab, and they get they get a training. I hope it's a good training in field work and specimen-based, systematic paleontology. So hopefully we're not going to go extinct anytime soon. Like I said.
If you'll indulge me, one final question, then I'll stop. They've got like a million others, but I'll just one final question.
Sure.
As much as you are looking for trilobites and everything else, have you ever found anything else that when you're out looking for the trilobites that just totally blew your mind?
Yes. So, most of my work has been in the Cambrian, the lower Cambrian. I have found Burgess shale-like fossils unexpectedly. I found, do you know what Anomalocaris is? That big predator with the sort of, claws at its front end there. So I found a big Anomalocaris appendage. Well, I say big, I mean, it was about that big. Found those unexpectedly, that was a real eye-opener. There's a small number of new soft-bodied sites that I've discovered as a part of my field work. Oftentimes I find trilobites that I'm not looking for, so I'll be looking for one kind of trilobite and find another. So that's always nice when you find unexpected trilobites. But most of my work being in the Cambrian, there's not an awful lot, especially in the lower Cambrian, there's not an awful lot of other fossil groups around in the shelly bit of the fossil record, apart from just trilobites and brachiopods. Things like, somebody mentioned nautiloids, cephalopods, snails, things like that. They really don't come in. I mean, there's a few of them around in the Cambrian, but they really don't kick in any good numbers until you get into the Ordovician. But I found, I've done also lots of field work in the Ordovician and in the Carboniferous, some in the Devonian too. And in all of those times, all of those places, I've been lucky in finding lots of other cool things as well. So.
Excuse me, folks. At this point, I'm going to stop recording and just open the discussion to everything and anybody.
Okay, sounds good.
If you want to stick around, Mark, be my guest. You'll
Okay,
probably be main topic anyway.
I'll be happy to answer